My name is Florian Walter and I'm the CEO, CTO, CMO, COO and janitor of TwoTap.io, and I think it's time for another status update. First of all, the website is going great. I have daily users, there are searches every day, and it's a really nice feeling seeing that people actually use the website. Even though I haven't done much marketing yet because I had to focus on the technical stuff first, I want to do much more marketing from now on to raise the daily users and eventually monetize this whole project. And I'm really pumped because it's a lot of fun, and seeing that it works and that people actually use it is an amazing feeling. Second, I drew the winners for the book giveaway I've done recently, and their usernames on TwoTap are Joe Williams 007, Spencer Damon and Ismail. Those are the winners of the physical book, the print book. And an ebook won each Tony Z, DB Tech Projects, Harris Up 777, Hero Kichotic and Peter Checke 4179. And a coupon code for one of Philip's Android courses won Daniel, Bismatho IQ, sorry I can't pronounce all your names, Ibrahim 3103, Astro, and I Make Stuff. I wasn't able to reach all of you via email yet, so if your name appeared on this list, please check your inbox so I can get in contact with you. Okay, now to the main part of the video. I made two big changes to the code of TwoTap.io, the server and the front end. First, I migrated from plain JavaScript to TypeScript. Secondly, I migrated from normal vanilla React to NextJS, which is another framework on top of React. In this video I want to talk about why I did these migrations and why I think that you should not start real project in plain JavaScript or plain React these days. You probably know that JavaScript is a weakly dynamically typed language, which means that if you come from something like Java or Kotlin, where you have to give a variable an explicit type and then you can only put this type into this variable or pass this specific type to a function, for example, this doesn't exist in JavaScript. In JavaScript you can basically put everything anywhere you want, and if it doesn't fit at runtime, then you will get a runtime exception. And we know that having our code fail at compile time is much better than having it fail at runtime, because runtime is when people are already using it. So building a real big project in a dynamically typed language is like building a castle on sand. It's just not solid, and it's very easy later to break without you noticing it. As far as I know, JavaScript was never really meant for big projects, but for smaller scripts basically. But nowadays people are building big projects with JavaScript, and this is why Microsoft invented another layer on top of JavaScript, which is called TypeScript. And as the name implies, it's JavaScript but with types. When you set up TypeScript, you have a configuration file where you can decide how strict the language is. And if you set it to strict, which is recommended in general, then it behaves very similar to a Kotlin. We have null safety, where we can't just put null in any variable we want without explicitly declaring it. And we have, for example, stuff like type inference, where we don't always have to say what type a variable can have if it can be inferred from the value we put in there. So TypeScript with strict mode is very similar to Kotlin, and since React is very similar to Jetpack Compose, in my opinion, if you are an Android developer that used Kotlin and Jetpack Compose before, then you can also build websites with TypeScript and React with just a little bit of extra learning. But these frameworks and languages are very similar. They're almost the same basically. This is why I had an easy time switching to web development, because I already knew this stuff from Android. As I already mentioned, I would not build a real big project in plain JavaScript in the future. It's just not really nice to build robust code with it, but TypeScript is amazing for it, and I posted some learning resources on TwoTap. And I also posted the resources I used to migrate my projects from JavaScript to TwoTap. So you can either search for TypeScript on TwoTap, or you can go to my profile on TwoTap and check the tab of my posted resources. There you will find them. And I also rewrote my whole website, the whole front end in Next.js. Next.js is another framework on top of React, which is mainly better for SEO, search engine optimization, but it also has some other great benefits that I don't want to miss anymore in the future. The problem with normal React is that it's completely client-side rendered. And if you used my website TuTap in the past, when it was still normal React, then you could see that it behaved very similar like a mobile app. By that I mean you would open a page on the website, the page would open almost instantly, basically, but you would see a loading spinner when there is some data that has to be loaded, just like you see a loading spinner in mobile apps usually. This is different to how websites have been rendered in the past, where you make a request to a server and you get a complete page with all the content back, not an empty shell where there's a spinner and data has to be loaded into it. And this is why normal React websites only work with JavaScript enabled, because JavaScript is what takes care of loading the data on the screen. Whereas a normal HTML website would work without JavaScript because you get a finished HTML with all the data already back from the server. You don't have to execute code that loads more data from the backend. Now, such a client-side rendered React website feels very modern because it feels like a real app. But there are some problems with this, mainly when it comes to search engines. Because as far as I know, not all search engine crawlers can actually read the content of the website if it's loaded later by JavaScript. They only see this empty shell, basically, with the loading spinner. Now, I think Google's crawlers can actually execute JavaScript and load this data, but you still have the problem that you don't have the different pages indexed. Because of how routing happens, navigation happens within the app, Google search couldn't find the different pages of the website, which of course is not great for search engine optimization if you want people to find your website through Google. So for TuTap in the past, there was only one single entry in Google search, and this was basically the starting page of the website. Now in the past, this wasn't really a problem for TuTap because the website basically only had this one functionality. So it wasn't really important that Google could find different pages on the website because there weren't really any useful pages that should be indexed. But this changed when I decided to add a blog to TuTap. Of course, marketing is important, and a blog is a really nice way of marketing. You write useful content, which should then be indexed by Google. People search for these keywords, find the content, get to the website, they see the rest of the website and start using your product. That's marketing, and that's search engine optimization. But if you create a blog in normal React, then you have all the problems I mentioned before. These different blog posts won't be indexed by Google. They can't be found by Google at all, which of course makes the whole blog useless as a marketing tool. And this is where Next.js comes into play. Next.js gives you the option to not only have client-side rendering, but decide for each page on the website individually. Do you want to have client-side rendering like in the past in normal React? Do you want to load the data from the server? And if you load the data from the server, should the HTML be generated one time at compile time, which is very fast because all the HTML is already ready and just have to be served to the user? Or does the data change frequently, and whenever the user makes a request to the website, we also have to make a new request to the server and load data from the database? So you have these three different main options: client-side rendering, then this static server-side rendering, and this more dynamic server-side rendering. Client-side rendering with Next.js has the exact same behavior and problems like client-side rendering on React. You have the progress bar, you don't have this indexing by Google. But for pages like my blog, I can switch to server-side rendering. And the way this works in Next.js is actually pretty straightforward. So you have different methods or functions that you can implement whenever you want to load data from the server, which basically take care of loading this data and then returning it to your component. Whereas before you did all the data loading client-side within the component. So getStaticProps, for example, is the function that you use in Next.js if you want to do a server-side rendering and fetch all the data at compile time already. This means when I compile the project in order to then ship it, release it to the public, then Next.js will go ahead and do everything I do in here in this function. In this case, I fetch my blog post from my backend, then I prepare it to turn it from Markdown into HTML. This is not so important, and then I simply return it here. Then at compile time, Next.js will go ahead, load this data and create HTML from this. And then this HTML will be served to users whenever they open this page, which means that when a user opens a blog post on my blog, then there will be no request to the backend at all. Instead, all the static HTML is already ready and will be served to the user. So let's try this out on TuTab. I added this new blog here. I have one blog post so far. And when I click this, we get served the ready-made HTML already. The blog post itself does not have to be fetched from the backend anymore. The HTML is already ready and it's basically laying on the server where my front end is uploaded, which we will come back to in a moment. And you will notice that when I click this, it will load almost instantly. Boom. And it's there. Only the picture head took a moment to load. But this here is super fast because the HTML is already ready, as I explained. And also, since it's server-side rendered, this blog post will appear in Google. Google can find this page, it can see the content, and it can index it properly. And it also has a proper title and everything that you can set in Next.js as well. So the other option for server-side rendering instead of getStaticProps, and by the way, these function names are fixed, so you have to use this exact function name in order to get this behavior. The other option is getServerSideProps. This is still server-side rendering, which means that the data will be loaded before the page is shown to the user, not a moment later with the progress bar, but they will see the ready-made page. The only difference here is that the data or the code I put in here will be executed every time a user opens the page, not at compile time, which means that it of course takes longer because each opening or each visit of this page does a request to the backend, but it shows the up-to-date data. For something like a blog post, for example, it's okay to fetch the data only at compile time because this doesn't need to change with each user request. These blog posts are only written by me, which means I know them in advance, and whenever I release a new blog post, I have to build a project again, fetch all the data and generate the HTML. But this is different for other pages. The search itself, for example, which is now also server-side rendered, but here the difference is that this data changes when a user adds a new resource to the database and another user makes a search later. Of course, we want to show this new resource. This is why, as opposed to the blog post, we cannot just generate the HTML at compile time and then serve it until the next time we compile the project. We need more up-to-date data. This is why we have to do a server request here every time a user executes a search. And this is why we use getServerSideProps instead of getStaticProps this time. This is the function you use in Next.js if you want to fetch the data every time the page is opened. Now there's a lot of little bit complicated code in here, but this is not so important. It's just the way I handle when a user types in an invalid page. Doesn't matter for this case. But yeah, in here we do just request on our backend. And we return this to the component, the same way we did it on the blog page. The only difference here is that we now also have to handle errors, because if the data is loaded with every request, of course there can be errors that can happen, like the server being down at this moment, for example, and then we want to show an error message. But just like the blog post itself, the search engine crawlers now can see all the content of this page here in advance, even if they don't execute JavaScript, because we get the whole page from the server. And you can also see the difference in how it loads. So as I mentioned, in the past we would load the empty page basically, and then we would see a progress bar like in an app. Now what happens instead is that we have this golden progress bar here at the top, because now this page here is stuck, so to speak, until the other page is loaded from the server, which makes sense, right? Because we need to wait until it's loaded, and now the server is doing all the backend fetching in advance. So now when I click search, you will notice that there is a little thin progress bar here at the top that indicates that something is loading, and then we get the whole page at once without the spinning progress bar. Again, that's the difference between client-side rendering and server-side rendering. Maybe it's also interesting to see an example where I mix server-side rendering and client-side rendering. I do this on the profile page. I'm gonna open this in an incognito tab so you can't see my email address. The profile data of the user up here is loaded via getServerSideProps, again with each request, because it can change when the user updates their data, and we want to show the most updated data whenever a user opens this page. But I'm also loading some data client-side. And that's the case for the posted resources here at the bottom. You will see when I refresh the page that there will be a spinning progress bar like in the good old times for a moment. And why do I do this? Because I don't want the page to wait for this here to load. This data down here is not so important for someone to see, and it's also not important for search engine crawlers. Now the search results here are loaded in advance because they are important for the content of the page, and they also should appear in search engines. The posted resources, on the other hand, they basically don't matter. I don't need them to appear in search engines, in Google search, and more importantly, I don't want the page to load that long and wait for these resources to be loaded. And this is really the cool thing about Next.js, that you have this full control over when you render data server-side and client-side, and you can mix these two however you want. Again, I mainly did the switch to Next.js for the blog, but it also opens up some cool possibilities for the future. For example, I want to generate pages for different search queries to show up in Google. For example, if someone searches in Google for JavaScript tutorials, I want the search results for JavaScript already populated with the results here from my database to show up as a separate entry in Google. You can really do some cool stuff with Next.js, and it also has some other nice benefits. For example, you can put images in here just in their normal high resolution size, and Next.js automatically resizes them to the proper size. So if I right click on the logo, for example, and open this image in a new tab, you will see that this has the exact size that we show up here. And this is not prepared by me. This is generated by Next.js automatically. The file I have saved in my project is much bigger. The same is the case here for the blog image, for example. I have this saved as a high resolution image, but it only adds this image that has the exact size we need here. If I open it here, again, it's a slightly bigger one. This is really important for loading speed, and Next.js takes care of this automatically, which is just amazing. As the hosting for the Next.js app, I switched to Vercel. Those are the same guys that created Next.js, and they have this hosting platform for it, which is really optimized for it, makes a lot of stuff easier. So usually you want to use Vercel to host your Next.js app. And it's a really smart way of them to make money from Next.js, because of course Next.js itself is free, but they have this really optimized hosting for it, and then they can make money from it. And of course you need hosting anyway. I really like Vercel so far. It makes a lot of stuff very easier. For example, updates to the website are automatically deployed whenever I push a change to the main branch of the GitHub repository. As you can see here, this was the last commit I made to the main branch. I changed the text color. Then you just push this to main, and like a minute or 2 minutes later, this will automatically be deployed. And then on tutab.io, I can see the latest changes. They also create separate preview URLs for different commits and different branches in your GitHub repo. So there are a lot of nice features. They also have analytics and so on. Now, not affiliated with them, but it's really a no-brainer when you build a Next.js app. And I'm still on the trial right now, but I think the price is $20 per month. That's not a lot for all the convenience you get. And they also have something called Edge Network, which is their CDN, their content delivery network, which is automatically used when you put your website on Vercel, which means that the website will be served on different regions depending where the user is accessing the website, automatic caching and so on. They take care of a lot of stuff, which makes the website really fast, especially if you use the static rendering where it just has to serve HTML. Next.js also has a great documentation that teaches you everything. They have a Get Started tutorial, which I also posted to tutab. And you can even build your whole backend in Next.js as well. So you don't even need a separate hosting for the server. You can put these API routes into the same code project, and they basically behave very similar to how Express works with Node.js. Now, I didn't want to rewrite my whole server in Next.js, so I still have the separate Express backend, which is completely fine. You can just use your own backend. You don't have to use these Next.js API routes if you don't want to. But it's a convenient way to combine two code bases into one. As I already said, I would not build a big project in normal JavaScript anymore, and I would also always use Next.js instead of normal React. It's just better in any way. That being said, it could be a bit overwhelming to learn React if you have never used it before and then learn all this server-side and client-side rendering at the same time. So it could make sense if you're still practicing to just build a normal vanilla React app first and then switch to Next.js when you're ready. This is what I've done. And by the way, how do you like the new design of TUTAP? If you have visited the website before, you will have noticed that I changed the colors here. Before we had these white cards and white modules, which is the default color of Bootstrap, the UI framework I'm using, but it wasn't really either a dark theme or a light theme. It was a mix between these two and I didn't really like that. I wanted to have a proper dark theme and I think I nailed it this time. I'm usually not good at design, but I'm really happy how this turned out with these different colors and the cards here and the block cards and everything. Now the text color is maybe still a bit too dark. I have to play around with this. But yeah, I really like the design and especially the colors of these tags here. Really cool. I want to add a separate light theme in the future, but of course this is not a priority right now. There are other features that are more important. I also fixed accessibility. This is easy to mess up and not pay attention to, but it's important that people who maybe can't use a mouse can use your website. So I took care that, for example, we can tap between all these different buttons here, the link, the vote buttons and so on, everything that's clickable. And you can always see where the focus is at the moment. So I took care of this as well. It's worth paying attention to this stuff. And I also started writing unit tests, which is really interesting as well. But I don't want to make this video here too lengthy. So I will talk about this in a separate video and I will keep you updated with the project. I'm happy if you use TUTAP. I would also be happy if you read my blog post I've recently written. I want to write more blog posts in the future. And what do you think about TypeScript? What do you think about Next.js? Have you used it yet? Would you use it in the future? Just leave a comment below and then have a nice day and happy coding.